It was a quiet afternoon in a typically busy downtown neighborhood, but the calm was shattered by the screeching sound of tires skidding on the wet road. A police officer, in a rush to respond to a call, spotted a black vehicle parked unusually close to a police station. The car's engine was running, its lights flickering in the misty rain. The officer, unfamiliar with the car and its owner, immediately assumed the worst. His fingers tightened around the grip of his weapon as he approached. His mind raced, his training kicking in. Could it be stolen? Was this another case of car theft? His eyes narrowed as he cautiously approached the driver's side. A man in uniform sat in the driver's seat, a lieutenant. But the officer didn't recognize him. The officer's hand shook slightly as he drew his weapon, directing it at the man in the car. "Step out of the vehicle," he barked, his voice laced with authority, but also with an edge of fear. The lieutenant's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the officer's agitation. "Is there a problem, officer?" the lieutenant asked, his voice steady, his eyes searching the officer's face for a hint of recognition. But the officer didn't recognize him. All he saw was a man in a uniform, sitting in a car near a stolen police vehicle. His training told him not to take chances. "Step out now," he repeated, louder this time, the weapon still trained on the man in the car. The lieutenant complied slowly, his hands raised to show he meant no harm. But inside, his heart raced. He could feel the danger, the tension, building between them. He had been in situations like this before, but this felt different. This officer wasn't seeing him as an equal. He was seeing a threat. "Can I ask why you've drawn your weapon?" the lieutenant asked, his voice calm, but there was a quiet authority in it. The officer didn't respond. His eyes flicked from the lieutenant to the car, scanning for any signs of movement, any excuse to escalate the situation. "I said step away from the vehicle." The officer's words were sharp now, almost desperate. The lieutenant's mind raced. What was happening here? This wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was a breakdown in communication, fueled by assumptions and bias. But how far would this officer go before realizing his mistake? He could feel the weight of the weapon in his face, the tension thick in the air. There was a moment of silence, as both men stood there, the officer with his weapon drawn, the lieutenant with his hands up in surrender. Neither man wanted to make the first wrong move. The lieutenant knew he couldn't act rashly. One wrong word, one wrong gesture, and things could escalate beyond repair. The officer's voice was shaky now. "Who are you?" His words barely registered, but the fear in his voice was clear. The lieutenant kept his posture calm, not letting the officer's anxiety affect him. The response was simple. "I'm a lieutenant in this department." The words hung in the air between them. "You may want to check my ID." The officer hesitated. His eyes darted back and forth between the lieutenant and the car. For a moment, the officer was frozen, trying to process the situation. Did he have the wrong person? Could he be facing an officer, someone from his own department, someone who had every right to be there? The tension in the air felt suffocating. But neither man moved, waiting for the next step, unsure of what would come next. The officer stood there, his weapon still aimed at the lieutenant, his mind scrambling for an explanation. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had followed his training, reacted in what he believed was the right way. Yet, the man in front of him was no ordinary suspect. The lieutenant's calmness, his words, and his demeanor were throwing him off balance. "Check my ID," the lieutenant repeated, his voice steady but laced with an underlying frustration. He made no sudden movements, knowing that any action, no matter how small, could escalate the situation. He understood how dangerous this could be, how easily a misunderstanding like this could turn deadly. The officer's fingers tightened around the weapon, and for a split second, the lieutenant wondered if he was about to witness a tragic mistake. Was the officer so entrenched in his assumption that he couldn't see the truth? Or was it something deeper, a fear rooted in the lieutenant's appearance, his uniform, his very identity? Who are you really? The officer's voice shook slightly now, his own uncertainty creeping through. What's going on here? His gaze flickered to the lieutenant's hands, which were still raised above his head, giving the officer no reason to feel threatened. But that didn't matter. The officer's mind was clouded with doubt, suspicion clouding his judgment. The lieutenant didn't respond right away. He knew the officer wasn't asking for his name. He was asking something deeper, something more unsettling. The lieutenant could feel the weight of racial bias in the air, the unspoken assumptions that came with it. It wasn't about him being a threat, it was about what the officer saw when he looked at him, a black man in uniform, in a city already fraught with tension. It was the officer's fear, not the lieutenant's actions, that was escalating the situation. Listen, the lieutenant said, his voice still calm, though his patience was wearing thin. I'm not the man you think I am. I'm an officer. Just like you. The officer didn't lower his weapon. He was still processing the lieutenant's words, trying to piece together the situation in front of him. But his mind was still clouded with doubt, and the more he stared at the lieutenant, the more the officer questioned himself. Was it really him? Could the lieutenant be telling the truth? Or was this some sort of trap, a way to get him off guard? The lieutenant could see the confusion in the officer's eyes. He could see the struggle. Half of the officer wanted to believe him, but the other half couldn't let go of the possibility that he might be wrong, that he might be too lenient. Just check my badge, the lieutenant repeated, slowly lowering his hands. The movement was deliberate, measured. He had to make it clear that he wasn't a threat. If he did anything too quickly, the officer's reaction could be unpredictable. For a long moment, the officer didn't move, his eyes locked on the lieutenant. The rain drizzled down around them, the sound of it hitting the pavement filling the silence between them. Neither of them spoke. The tension was suffocating. Finally, with a slow, deliberate motion, the officer lowered his weapon, just slightly, but enough for the lieutenant to notice. His eyes never left the lieutenant's face, his body language still stiff, on edge. Just stay where you are, the officer muttered, his voice distant, almost to himself. It wasn't a command, it was a plea, an effort to regain control of a situation that had spiraled beyond his grasp. The lieutenant stood still, waiting. He wasn't sure how this would end, but he could feel the shift in the officer's posture. The weapon, though still in hand, was no longer aimed directly at him. It was as if the officer was beginning to accept that maybe, just maybe, he had made a mistake. The seconds stretched on. In those moments, it felt as if everything hung in the balance, the officer's reputation, the lieutenant's safety, and the fragile peace that hung between them. I'm not here to hurt you, the lieutenant said softly, his voice finally breaking the silence. I'm not your enemy. It was then that the officer's expression flickered. For a brief moment, there was a recognition, a realization that perhaps he had been wrong all along. The officer glanced down at the badge in his hand, unsure of what to do next. And in that moment, the weight of the situation finally settled. The officer's hand tightened around the badge, his fingers trembling. It was clear now, the man in front of him wasn't a threat. He wasn't a criminal or a car thief. He was one of his own, a fellow officer who had been mistaken for something else entirely. But the damage had already been done. The tension in the air was palpable, and the officer's mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. How could he have made such a mistake? The lieutenant stood frozen, watching the officer's internal conflict play out before him. His body was still, but inside, his heart pounded. He could feel the anger bubbling up, the unfairness of the situation crashing over him. Why did he have to be the one to face this kind of scrutiny? Why was his identity, his very existence, questioned the moment he stepped into a police vehicle? But the lieutenant held his ground. He couldn't allow himself to show any weakness, any emotion. He knew that this moment was bigger than him. If he let his frustration show, if he acted out of anger, it could escalate everything further. He couldn't let that happen. The officer's gaze shifted from the badge back to the lieutenant's face. The air between them was thick with unspoken words. The lieutenant could see the officer's struggle. He wanted to apologize, to make things right, but at the same time, he was still unsure, still wrapped in the fog of his assumptions. "I'm not your enemy," the lieutenant repeated softly, hoping the officer would finally hear him. But the officer didn't respond. His eyes were still locked on the lieutenant, as if searching for something to confirm that he hadn't made a terrible mistake. His finger hovered just above the trigger, the tension of the moment too much for him to bear. Was the lieutenant really who he said he was? Could he trust him? The lieutenant took a slow step forward, carefully, never breaking eye contact. He needed the officer to see that he was just a man, just like him, doing his job. "I'm here to help," the lieutenant said, his voice calm but firm. "You're not alone in this." The officer's breath caught, his shoulders relaxing just slightly. He lowered his weapon another inch, though his hands remained shaky. His mind was still fighting with the idea that this situation could have been avoided, that things didn't need to get so tense. But now, standing face to face with a fellow officer, he was starting to see things clearly. "I didn't mean to." The officer's voice cracked, and for the first time, the lieutenant could hear the guilt in it. He wasn't sure if it was for the mistake he'd made or for the fear that had overtaken him in that split second. But whatever it was there, and the lieutenant could see it in his eyes. The officer's pride had been shattered, and he knew it. "It's okay," the lieutenant said, taking another careful step forward. "We've all been there. It's about what we do next that matters." The officer's weapon lowered completely now, his hands hanging limply at his sides. He was no longer a threat to the lieutenant, but the weight of what had just happened was pressing on him, sinking into the pit of his stomach. "I should have known better," he muttered, almost to himself. "I shouldn't have let fear take over." The lieutenant nodded. Fear can cloud judgment. It's something we all need to fight against, especially when we're in positions like this. For a long moment, neither man moved. The lieutenant could feel the officer's gaze, heavy with regret, but also with a sense of relief. The tension that had once filled the air had slowly begun to dissipate. The officer wasn't pointing his weapon at him anymore, and that was a small victory in itself. But the lieutenant knew that the story wasn't over. They were still standing in the middle of a street, both men caught in the aftermath of a moment that could have easily ended differently. And now, there was only one thing left to do: move forward. "We're all human," the lieutenant said finally, his voice softer now. "It's how we learn from this that makes us who we are." The officer's eyes met his once again, this time with a flicker of understanding. The two of them stood there, in the quiet aftermath of a moment that had nearly spiraled out of control, realizing that the real work was only just beginning. The rain continued to fall softly around them, a distant hum of passing cars serving as the only sound breaking the otherwise heavy silence. The officer stood motionless, still processing the gravity of the situation. The lieutenant, sensing the officer's internal turmoil, decided it was time to finally end the uncertainty that had built up between them. The air had thickened with tension, but now, it was time for clarity. "Listen," the lieutenant said, his voice breaking the silence, "I understand what happened. But you need to know who I really am." The officer, still holding his weapon loosely in his hands, glanced at the lieutenant. There was a moment of hesitation before he slowly spoke, his voice filled with uncertainty. "You're telling me the truth, right? I mean, you really are." The lieutenant's eyes didn't waver as he slowly reached for his badge, pulling it from under his jacket and holding it out for the officer to see. "I'm a lieutenant," he stated, his voice firm now. "In this very department. And if you'd bothered to check, you would have known that." The officer's eyes widened as he took in the badge in his hand, his own disbelief evident on his face. Slowly, he took a step back, his entire body language showing the weight of what had just unfolded. The realization hit him like a brick wall. It was him. The man he had almost pointed a weapon at, the man he had almost hurt, was one of his own. A fellow officer. But not just any officer, one with a higher rank, someone who should have been treated with respect. He had allowed his assumptions, his biases, and his fears to override his sense of judgment. The officer felt his stomach twist in a knot, his face flushing with embarrassment. He couldn't believe what he had just done. For a moment, he stood there in stunned silence, staring at the badge in his hand, as if trying to will himself to come to terms with the situation. "Why didn't you identify yourself sooner?" the officer asked, his voice thick with regret. "Why didn't you tell me you were an officer?" The lieutenant sighed deeply, his expression softening. "I did," he replied, his tone a mixture of frustration and understanding. "But in a moment like that, when a weapon is drawn on you, you can't just explain yourself away. You have to think carefully about what you do next. I couldn't afford to make any sudden movements, any mistakes." The officer nodded slowly, the weight of the lieutenant's words sinking in. I should have realized it sooner," he muttered, lowering his head slightly, almost ashamed. "I let fear get in the way. I don't know what I was thinking." The lieutenant took a step forward, not to get closer, but to show that he wasn't going to let the officer wallow in his own shame. "Fear is powerful," he said gently. "It clouds our judgment. We all have our biases, some conscious, some not, but it's how we deal with them that defines us." The officer looked up at him, his eyes filled with a mix of guilt and admiration. He had thought this was just another routine stop, but now, he was confronted with something far deeper. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I should have never drawn my weapon." The lieutenant placed a hand on his shoulder, offering a small but genuine smile. "It's okay," he said, his voice calm. "You didn't intend for it to happen. The mistake was made, but we both have a choice now. We can either let this define us or learn from it." The officer nodded, his shoulders slowly relaxing. "You're right. I don't want to let this define me. I need to learn from it." The lieutenant took a step back, his expression serious but understanding. "We all need to. Every day is a chance to do better. But you have to be honest with yourself and see your own biases, even when it's uncomfortable." The officer absorbed the lieutenant's words, the heaviness of the situation beginning to shift. He was starting to see that this encounter wasn't just about one mistaken identity, it was about the deeper issues that lay beneath the surface. It was about the need for self-reflection, the need to acknowledge where we go wrong and work towards doing better. As the rain began to let up, the tension between them eased, though the weight of the lesson lingered. The officer realized that, in some ways, this moment would stay with him forever. But more importantly, he had learned something that he would carry with him long after the rain had stopped. And for the lieutenant, the realization that he had been treated unfairly didn't end in bitterness. He had been the one in danger, but now he had a chance to offer something far more valuable: understanding. As the rain began to subside, the two men stood in the stillness, the tension that had once hung in the air now slowly dissipating. But the aftermath was far from over. The officer's hand, still clutching the lieutenant's badge, was now trembling slightly. His mind was racing, the weight of his actions pressing heavily on him. He had made a critical mistake, one that could have cost someone's life, and yet, it hadn't, thanks to the lieutenant's calm and composure. The officer took a deep breath, looking up at the lieutenant, who still stood in front of him with that steady gaze. The lieutenant wasn't angry, wasn't pushing the officer to admit his fault. Instead, he just stood there, waiting. Waiting for the officer to come to terms with what had just happened. I don't know what to say," the officer muttered, looking down at the ground. His voice was full of shame. He wanted to apologize, but the words felt stuck in his throat. How could he make amends for what he had almost done? How could he take back the fear, the weapon that had been drawn in error? The lieutenant, sensing the officer's struggle, took a slow step toward him. "You don't have to say anything," he said, his voice soft but firm. "It's not about what you say, it's about what you do next." The officer looked up, meeting the lieutenant's gaze. "I never meant for this to happen. I swear. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I didn't see you. I didn't see you as another officer, as someone who deserved respect. I saw something else." The lieutenant nodded, understanding. "That's the problem, right? When fear and assumptions cloud our judgment, we stop seeing people as they truly are. And we start seeing what we expect them to be." The officer swallowed hard, guilt overtaking him again. "I let my fear take over. I let my biases control my actions. And I almost hurt you." The lieutenant didn't say anything at first. Instead, he placed his hand gently on the officer's shoulder, offering a sense of comfort in the moment. "You didn't hurt me," he said quietly. "You didn't pull the trigger. You recognized your mistake before it was too late. That's what matters." The officer nodded slowly, as if processing the lieutenant's words, weighing them against the heavy guilt he had carried since drawing his weapon. "But I still have to make this right, don't I?" His voice was tinged with uncertainty, but there was also a glimmer of resolve in it now. The lieutenant smiled, though it was a quiet smile, one filled with understanding. Making it right doesn't always mean erasing what happened. Sometimes, it means learning from it, owning up to it, and doing better next time. The officer breathed a sigh of relief. For the first time in what felt like hours, the weight on his chest lifted slightly. "You're right. I've learned a lot today. More than I ever thought I would." The lieutenant nodded. "We all have our moments. It's not about being perfect, it's about being willing to grow." A few moments of silence passed between them, the officer still holding the lieutenant's badge, now almost like a symbol of the trust that had been rebuilt in those few words. The situation had been dangerous, but now, with the rain having ceased and the tension easing, both men understood that this encounter had a purpose beyond the confrontation. It was a chance to reflect, to acknowledge the ways in which they both could be better. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to undo what almost happened," the officer admitted. "But I promise you, I won't forget this." The lieutenant's gaze softened. "That's all any of us can do. Remember. And move forward with the lesson learned." With that, the officer handed the lieutenant's badge back to him, his fingers still trembling slightly but now filled with a sense of respect. The lieutenant took it, his hand brushing against the officer's in a gesture that carried no malice, only understanding. "I'll let you get back to your duty," the officer said, his voice steadier now. "And I'll make sure I never make this mistake again." The lieutenant gave him a final nod, signaling the end of the tense encounter. "I'll be watching you," he said with a small smile. "But I know you'll do better." As the two men parted ways, the officer stood there for a moment longer, watching the lieutenant walk away, the weight of the encounter still settling in his mind. He had learned something important today, something that would stay with him far longer than the physical scars of the situation ever could. He had learned that judgment, when clouded by fear and bias, could lead to disastrous consequences. But he had also learned that there was room for growth, for redemption. And with that, he walked back to his patrol car, determined to be a better officer, a better man, moving forward. The lesson was simple but profound. It wasn't enough to simply do the job. One had to be aware, open, and willing to challenge their own assumptions. It was a hard truth to swallow, but it was a truth that would shape the officer for years to come. The next few days passed in a haze for the officer. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the lieutenant's face, the calmness, the wisdom that radiated from someone who had been in his shoes, who had seen the darker side of the world and still found the strength to forgive. He couldn't stop thinking about how close he had come to making a decision that would have haunted him for the rest of his life. Each time he entered his patrol car, the weight of what he had done pressed down on him. The image of his weapon drawn, his finger just an inch away from pulling the trigger, was etched into his mind. He had almost taken an innocent man's life. And not just anyone, he had nearly killed a fellow officer. That fact alone made him sick to his stomach. The lieutenant, on the other hand, seemed to move on effortlessly. He was back at his post, back to his work. The officer had heard that he had been called into a meeting with their superiors, likely to discuss what had happened, but nothing came of it. The lieutenant had simply moved forward with the grace and dignity of someone who had learned to carry their burdens without letting them break them. But for the officer, it wasn't so simple. He had to confront his own actions, had to dig deep to understand how he could have acted so recklessly. He had spent his entire career being taught to protect, to serve, to ensure justice was served. But in that moment, he hadn't done any of those things. He hadn't served the law, he had been driven by fear and assumptions. Every time he ran into someone who looked like the lieutenant, his stomach would twist with the knowledge of his mistake. It wasn't just the lieutenant, he realized that he had let his fear shape his perception of people far too often. How many times had he judged someone by their appearance, by what he thought he knew, without truly understanding them? It was hard to swallow. The truth was painful, but it was necessary. And as much as he wanted to bury the memory, to move on without reflecting too deeply, he knew he couldn't. One evening, after finishing his shift, the officer drove by the same street where everything had happened. The street was quiet now, the night thick with silence. As he passed by, he couldn't help but stop, his car slowing to a halt. The memories came rushing back, of the lieutenant's calm voice, his unwavering confidence despite the weapon aimed at him, the apology that followed, and the lesson he had learned. The officer sat in his car for a long time, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, lost in thought. It had been weeks since that encounter, but he still couldn't shake the feeling that something needed to change. The lesson he had learned wasn't just about what had happened that day, it was about everything he had failed to see before. The biases, the prejudices, the assumptions he had carried with him his entire life. The officer realized something, he needed to do more than just reflect on his mistakes. He needed to take action. He needed to ensure that his future decisions were informed by understanding, not fear. He had a responsibility, not just to the job, but to himself. To challenge the biases that had crept into his thinking, to see people for who they truly were, not for who he feared them to be. He turned the car around, heading toward the precinct. It wasn't a decision he made lightly. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but the officer understood that he had to begin somewhere. He had to face the consequences of his actions, and he knew that confronting the very biases that had led him to draw his weapon was a necessary first step. As he walked into the precinct that night, he couldn't help but think of the lieutenant's words, "We all need to learn from our mistakes." The officer had learned. But now, it was time to put that lesson into practice. The journey wouldn't be without its challenges. But the officer knew that, like the lieutenant, he would find a way to move forward, to be better. The mistakes of the past didn't have to define him. What mattered was how he chose to learn from them, how he chose to move forward. And for the officer, that was the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter where understanding and growth would take precedence over fear and judgment. It wouldn't be easy, but it was a road worth traveling. In the days that followed, he sought out conversations with colleagues, learning from their experiences and acknowledging his own mistakes. He attended workshops on bias, racial sensitivity, and de-escalation tactics. Slowly, the officer began to change, not just in the way he approached his work, but in the way he viewed the world around him. The lieutenant, though, remained a quiet reminder of that pivotal moment. The officer had been lucky. His life, his career, and the lieutenant's life had all been spared by the realization that fear could be overcome and that growth was always possible. But for the officer, This wasn't just about learning how to be a better cop, it was about becoming a better person, someone who could see past his biases and understand the world from someone else's perspective. And that, he realized, was the most important lesson of all. Weeks passed, and the officer's efforts to better himself didn't go unnoticed. Slowly but surely, the changes he made in his own life began to reflect in his actions, both on and off the job. He had fully embraced the lessons he had learned from that tense encounter, the moment that had forever altered his perspective. The officer now walked with a new sense of purpose, one grounded in humility and self-awareness. It wasn't an easy transition. At times, doubt crept into his mind. He wondered if he had done enough, if he could truly change the deep-seated biases that had been ingrained in him over the years. But each day, he pushed forward, reminding himself that growth was a continuous journey, not a single destination. One afternoon, as he was walking into the precinct, he saw the lieutenant. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, there was an unspoken acknowledgement between them, of the shared experience, of the mutual respect that had developed between two men who had once been strangers caught in a misunderstanding. The officer walked over to the lieutenant, who was speaking with a fellow officer. He stood there for a moment, unsure of how to begin. But the lieutenant noticed him and gave him a nod, signaling him to approach. "You look different," the lieutenant said, his voice calm but observant. The officer smiled slightly, his hands in his pockets. "I've been trying. I'm not the same man I was that day." The lieutenant nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I figured as much. It's not about making a mistake, it's about what you do after it. What you learn from it." The officer's smile faded slightly, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I thought about that day a lot, and I realized I wasn't just failing in that moment. I was failing myself, and everyone around me. I let fear and assumptions dictate my actions." The lieutenant studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You're not alone in that. Fear is a powerful thing, and we all have biases we don't always see. The key is being willing to acknowledge them and change. It's never easy." The officer nodded, feeling the weight of the lieutenant's words. "I've been trying to be better, to see people for who they truly are, not just based on what I assume or fear." The lieutenant's expression softened. "That's the first step. It's not about perfection, it's about being open to learning, to growing. And the fact that you're aware of it, that you're trying to make a change, is more than a lot of people ever do." The officer looked up, meeting the lieutenant's eyes, and there was a quiet understanding between them. "Thank you for helping me see what I needed to. I don't think I would have figured it out without you." The lieutenant gave a small, knowing smile. "It's not me you should thank, it's you. You chose to make the change. I'm just here to remind you that we're all capable of it." For the first time since that day, the officer truly felt at peace. He knew that he still had work to do, he knew that he would continue to face moments where his assumptions would try to creep back in. But now, he had the tools, the awareness, and the humility to face them head-on. He would no longer let fear control him. The two men stood there for a few more moments, exchanging a quiet understanding, before the lieutenant gave a final nod and walked away. The officer watched him leave, grateful for the wisdom that had been shared, but more grateful for the chance to change, to learn, and to move forward with a new sense of purpose. As the officer made his way back to his patrol car, he felt lighter. There was still much work ahead of him, but he had come a long way from that fateful day. The journey of growth was ongoing, but with each step, he was becoming a better version of himself. A version who no longer let fear and assumptions guide his actions. A version who understood that true strength came from humility, empathy, and the willingness to learn. In the end, the life lesson was clear: it wasn't the mistakes that defined us, but how we responded to them. We all had the power to change, to evolve, and to build a better world, one decision, one action, one understanding at a time. And that, the officer knew, was the most important lesson of all.